Today in Texas, a federal court will hear arguments about whether detainees who reportedly witnessed the death of a Cuban migrant in an ICE detention center can be deported as the family prepares a wrongful death lawsuit. Now, the circumstances of 55-year-old Geraldo Lunas Campos's death earlier this month are under intensifying scrutiny after the El Paso medical examiner deemed his death a homicide, at odds with initial ICE reports that he experienced medical distress while in segregation. And emergency call recordings have emerged showing staff at Camp East Montana reported Lunas Campos's death as an apparent suicide. But a witness alleges they saw staff choke him until he lost consciousness. MS Now's Rosa Flores joins us from outside that detention center in El Paso, Texas. Also with us, immigration attorney Alan Orr. Rosa, this is so disturbing, and we have these two very different narratives about this one man's death in custody. What are we expecting from today's hearing?
Well, Anna, it's important to note that a federal judge has already issued a temporary restraining order barring the federal government from deporting two key witnesses. But attorneys have found additional witnesses, at least 4. And so in court today, what these defense attorneys are going to be arguing is for these protections to extend to all witnesses that they find. And they're hoping that this judge converts the temporary restraining order into a preliminary injunction. As you mentioned, there have been changing stories by the administration. Let me take you through this, because the first statement that was issued by ICE was issued on January 9th. And ICE announced the death of Mr. Geraldo Lunas Campos and stated that he had died after experiencing medical distress. MS Now, of course, reached out to DHS asking for comment about the story. The statement that we received said that Lunas Campos was attempting to commit suicide. I want to read you a portion of the statement we received. DHS said, quote, Campos violently resisted the security staff and continued to attempt to take his life. During the ensuing struggle, Campos stopped breathing and lost consciousness. Medical staff was immediately called and responded. After repeated attempts to resuscitate him, EMTs declared him deceased on the scene. We've obtained the autopsy report from the El Paso County Medical Examiner's Office. That autopsy report states that the manner of death is homicide and the cause of death is asphyxia. We've talked to the defense attorneys representing the family of Mr. Lunas Campos, and they say that they have at least 6 witnesses. They're, of course, looking for more, but that corroborate what they say is the alleged choking of Mr. Lunas Campos. Now, if you read some of the statements that have already been filed with the court, with the declarations of some of these witnesses, what you'll find is that these witnesses allege that Mr. Campos was wanting to receive his asthma medication. That medication was refused. He ended up in solitary confinement. And then I want to read you a portion of those witness declarations. One witness said, quote, I heard sounds of the guards punching Geraldo, the clanking of Geraldo's handcuffs, and the sound of shoes scrapping against the floor. Then I heard Geraldo saying, I have asthma, I can't breathe. I also heard Geraldo say, me estás asfixiando, which means you're asphyxiating me. This person goes on to say that then they heard silence. Ana, it's important to note again that DHS denies all of this. They stand by their statement and they say that their investigation continues.
So, Rosa, if any of these witnesses are deported, how would that impact the investigation and the family's attempt at accountability?
Well, that's what the defense attorneys are fighting in court. That's why they say that it is critical for these witnesses to be kept in the United States and not be deported. These attorneys tell us that they've learned that some of these witnesses have already received removal orders, deportation orders. That's why they're concerned. That's why they're in federal court trying to fight this, because they don't want the federal government to remove these individuals with critical accounts of what happened, of what they witnessed. Some of them saw what happened. Others say that they heard what happened. Now, the concern, of course, Ana, is that the Trump administration doesn't have the best record when it comes to DHS officials following court orders, and that's their concern. Take a listen.
Unfortunately, so far during this administration, we have seen many cases of authorities not completely abiding by lawful orders of the court. However, we have, in this case, every expectation that all parties, including the United States government, will abide by the lawful orders of the federal district court.
And Anna, it's important to note that a wrongful death lawsuit has not been filed. That is not what's going to be argued in court today. What is being argued in court today is for the preservation of evidence and for these witnesses to be allowed to stay in the United States so they can make statements and eventually be deposed once that wrongful death lawsuit is filed. Anna.
Rosa Flores, thank you for digging into this and shining light on this important case. Alan, what do you make of these competing narratives? How would a death like this normally be handled?
I think it would be handled much differently because the difference between the terminology is the difference between something happening to an individual and there also being a crime. And I think we need to put this in the bigger context of what's happening right now with detention in the United States. They're at 75% capacity from what it was last year. This is the 6th death since the beginning of 2026. There was a death in New Jersey in December of a Haitian man who was 41 years old, went in healthy one day and died the next. So this is a greater procedural question. And when you think about it in the span, we haven't had, in 2025, there were 32 deaths in detention centers. That's the most deaths since 2004. So there's a structural problem here with regards to what's happening in the investigation. And most of these detention facilities are held by private institutions and staffed by contractors. And that's where we have the breakdown in justice and the investigations.
So this is the same facility where ICE is actually sending many immigrants who were detained in Minnesota. DHS says despite the influx, they have, quote, maintained a higher standard of care than most prisons, writing in a statement, no lawbreakers in the history of human civilization have been treated better. But we'll note Campos is among 3 migrants who have died in this facility in just over a month. Alan, are there any safeguards in place to ensure detainees aren't mistreated at these kinds of centers?
So just like with the other safeguards within the Department of Justice, the one that would make sure these detention facilities are up to par are not there right now. And the American Immigration Council has already spoken about the bad facilities, the lack of being able to have access by a lawyer, but also just the health conditions within them. And there's a further reporting that their health contracts to the third-party contractors have not been paid since October. So a lot of the vendors aren't even supplying these facilities right now because they're not getting paid until April. So the actual numbers do not support what the government's saying about the detentions being up to par.
Alan Orr, thank you very much for joining us and offering your expertise.